Our next speaker is a professor of law, but he's marked out in my mind as a person who considers the underlying morality and philosophy in political issues, and I'm very pleased to introduce Martin Krygier.
Thank you very much, Fred. I've been asked to speak around a couple of proposals which came up in the online discussion. One around bills of rights and responsibilities, and another two, one that laws should be unified across states, and that states, as foci of government, should be abolished. They're different questions, but they have in common, they all have to do with an attempt or a thought that we need, in some ways, to limit government. The first, to limit what governments can do, to put some substantive limits. They can't interfere with certain rights, freedom of expression, for example. That's what a Bill of Rights is about. The others have to do, it appears, with a concern that there's too much government. There are too many of them, there are too many people, they do too much. These are all separate issues, of course. There may be too many of them, they may all be asleep, so they think that's great. But these are the sorts of issues that seem to concern a lot of people in this room, and I'll take them separately, but under a sort of way of asking questions about them, which I think is important, or at least it's important for me, to ask three questions about any sort of problem you have in politics, and in this order. First of all, what is the problem? What's your problem? Because unless you've worked through, well, do we really have a problem? How big a problem is it? Then rushing into a solution is a bit premature. You may not have a problem, may be not broke, so you don't fix it. So first of all, what is the problem you're about? Secondly, what are plausible solutions you think would fix that? But thirdly, and this is important too, apart from the consequences that you hope will come out of those solutions, are there things unintended consequences? Since everything we do in life has consequences we do intend and many that we don't intend, that's also true of politics. In fact, it's very true of politics. So trying to think ahead, since they're unintended, you're going to miss some, but to try to think ahead, what might be some downsides or some questions to be asked about proposals which really seem to do the trick. So what about bills of rights and responsibilities? That's actually, it's already a somewhat unusual phrase. Most of the bills of rights in the world are that, bills of rights, not rights and responsibilities. In communist countries, they used to have rights and responsibilities. That's because you couldn't enforce the rights and they wanted to insist on your responsibilities. Putting them together actually has some tensions, which I'll mention. But first of all, what's the problem? Well, presumably people think the problem is that we don't have a systematic, or we have a patchy, or we don't have an adequate protection of some fundamental rights. We have lots of rights protected, of course, because that's what laws do. We have lots of responsibilities insisted on, but the argument for a Bill of Rights has to betray some dissatisfaction with the coverage, with the comprehensiveness, with the adequacy of protection of rights, and maybe insisting on responsibilities. Well, how serious are those problems? Here it helps to look around the world. How well do we do? I want you to ask, or I hope you ask yourselves those sorts of questions. How well do we do compared to countries which have what is proposed, say a Bill of Rights? Say the United States, which has the first written Bill of Rights that was in a constitution. How well do we do compared to countries which don't have them, like, there are very few of them left, but we're one, and New Zealand is another. Well, in fact, New Zealand is not, but I won't get into that. And thirdly, secondly, what's the solution? I've got 10 minutes, so I'm just going to leave out everything that's important. Well, what are solutions to problems you have? Well, one of the solutions which has a lot of supporters in Australian tradition is rely on what we have. Well, what do we have? Well, something that lawyers talk about, because they think of bills of rights as specifically legal things. They say, look, we've got the common law. It's been there for centuries. Judges work over problems in cases that have come to them. There's a lot of track record there. There's a lot to go on. And you might say, yeah, there is, but they can only act on the particular cases that come to them. What if something important doesn't get to a court? What if it's kept from a court, like refugee court cases, because there's some legislation? So one problem, you might think, with common law is that it's patchy and that it's got gaps and that it can always be overridden by parliaments making laws. So you can say, well, what about our laws? We've got lots of laws. If we think there's a problem, get another law. Again, a proponent of something more might say, well, look, even if you've got a law, a later parliament can always override that earlier law. And so it's not guaranteed. Or you may have laws that themselves are patchy, that don't deal with some of the fundamental issues that are often seen to be the core of bills of rights. And so people talk about putting it in a constitution. That's fairly recent, historically. The Americans did it for the first time in the 18th century. What does that do? Well, legally, usually, it sticks it there. It's hard to get things into constitutions, particularly in Australia, and it's hard to get them out of constitutions. Some people think that's a good thing because they're valuable and they shouldn't be the play of particular parliamentary majorities. Other people think, well, we're stuck with them, and sometimes that can be a hindrance. And so some people say, look, one other thing, which actually seems to me enormously important, it's not what lawyers talk about, is, well, look, there's all this detail about the law, but what about the fact that Australia is an established democracy, it's got a public culture and civil society that are tolerant compared to a lot of countries, and it's generally respectful of rights and responsibilities, certainly more respectful than Mr. Mugabe is, though that was probably a cheating choice, but there are other dictators around the world. Perhaps you could enhance that by education or propaganda. Perhaps you could do other things. In other words, the problem about unsatisfactory treatment of rights is not always a legal problem, not always to be fixed by a legal solution. It might have something to do with the political culture, the ways of thought, the traditions in a society. And somebody will say, well, maybe that's imperfect, but so's the world, and that may be the best that you can hope for. I'm opening these as possibilities, not because I advocate any of them. I'm just being a pusillanimous weak. I'm not going to state a point of view. I just want to open possibilities for you. Well, say, as the online discussion did suggest, we have a Bill of Rights and Responsibilities. What's to think about that? What sort of bill should it be? Should it be in a constitution, as the American is, as many are? Well, the advantages of that, as I've said, is you can't get rid of it easily. The disadvantages is that you can't get rid of it easily. And it's hard to override it, it's hard to change it. So what about just putting it, as now is proposal in Australia and various jurisdictions, make it just a law, which can always be overridden by another law, so that Parliament is encouraged to take these fundamental considerations into account, but it's not stuck with them. That's fine, but what if you don't trust Parliament? You want them to be stuck with them. What rights should be in there? The tradition in the Western world is individual rights, that is, rights of individuals who might be hurt, as distinct from group rights, members of ethnic groups or minorities. You might want to think, well, and you have thoughts, as I see yesterday, about some of those possibilities. Another one is, what character of rights? The traditional bills of rights were worried about civil rights, like right to property, political rights, right to participate, right to vote. They weren't worried about socio-economic rights, rights to a job. And some old-style people say, well, if you're going to stick it in a legal document, it's much easier to enforce civil and political rights than to enforce socio-economic rights. Because, for example, if you've got an economic meltdown, government can't know, nobody seems to know, what to do tomorrow about these issues, and maybe that is a reason to think differently about socio-economic rights as somehow to be dealt with not by legal documents in the same way or constitutional documents. What about responsibilities? Which ones are important? And also something which did surprise me, it's easy to see how you would enforce a right. That is, you give somebody a right to sue in a court. It's harder to see how you legally enforce a responsibility.